Good evening all, and welcome. Before the video begins, I'd like to introduce the incredible Raven Reads to tonight's video. She's going to be joining us, narrating half of these taxi horror stories. When you're done, don't forget to go over to her channel and check out her volumes of amazing work, as I'm sure by the end of it you'll agree with me in saying she is an amazing narrator. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. My family loves traveling. So about a year ago, my family took a trip to France. At this time, I'm a 9th grader and in high school. Before the trip, my mum spent a few months learning French, and my sisters had some basic knowledge of the language, so we were set. We flew into some country in Europe, and then took the train all the way to Paris. Once we arrived in the train station, we took a few minutes to prepare ourselves before heading out and looking for a taxi. We were walking when suddenly a guy comes up to us. He knew some English and asked if we were looking for a taxi, since he had a large van taxi. My family was happy, since we have over a 5-person family. There aren't really enough seats in a regular taxi. So we agreed, and we walked over with him as he points out a large black van, with another guy sitting in the driver's seat. Now that I think of it, there's no reason that there are 2 taxi drivers in a car. The weird part was that it had no taxi indicators or anything on the van, stating that this was a taxi service. I remember my parents exchanging glances with each other, but going along with it. So at this point we haven't even discussed the price or where we were heading. He just opened the rather large trunk and started chucking our bags inside. At this point, my mum was worried. She demanded an answer on why there was no taxi indicator. The man began switching between English and French and wasn't giving a clear answer. She didn't push it. And my mum then asked for the price. It was a bit costly, but there are no other regular taxi vans around. And at this point, the man is getting the last of our luggage in, when we noticed my dad's attitude change. He seemed more concerned. He went up to the man, stopped him putting the last piece of luggage in the van, and he said, "Show me your taxi license." At this time, I didn't even know there was a taxi license. I guess neither did the man. His eyes widened and he seemed nervous. In very broken English, he said something along the lines of, Right, taxi license." He pretended to pat his pockets and acted like he left it at home. My parents at this point quickly grabbed the luggage and said thank you. We didn't need the taxi anymore. They quickly took us across the street and merged us into a large group of people getting away from the black van. We eventually found a taxi terminal and found a large van, and we never spoke of the event again. But I feel like I was that close to finding out whatever these people planned on doing with us.
This happened in April of 2018. I was about to take my lunch break at work when a friend of mine called and invited me to her house for lunch because it was her father's birthday. My workplace is 15 to 20 minutes away from her house, 45 to an hour if the traffic is heavy, so I didn't want to come at first. My friend insisted and said that one of the foods being served was carbonara, my favorite. Once I heard that carbonara was on the menu, I didn't have a second thought anymore. Knowing that I only had an hour for lunch, I ran to the taxi stand outside my workplace and hailed a cab to drive me to hers. When I boarded, I thought the taxi driver was a really chill person, smiling at me through the mirror and initiating small talk. He asked me questions about the weather, the traffic, which was really heavy at the time, and other things. It was pretty uneventful. He talked about himself. He was an overseas worker from Saudi Arabia who had just been vacationing in my country and had enough to buy a vehicle for a taxi service. He was a 40-year-old bachelor, and he said that his place was close to my work. I told him that I was on my way to a friend's to celebrate her father's birthday. I think sharing information on the road with a taxi driver is pretty commonplace and harmless, and I was in a pretty good mood back then. He started asking me if I had a boyfriend. At that point, I didn't really mind. Many people always say that I can pass off as Indian. Indian women are often perceived as attractive in my country, or for most people I know, and I seem to harbor the attention of older guys, 40 and over. I told him no. I can tell that he checked me out through the mirror more often, asking why I don't have a boyfriend if I was so pretty and petite. His interest peaked, and so did my alarm bells. By this time, the traffic is still unabated. He offered to bail on the birthday lunch and go with him instead. There's a nearby mall where I work, and we can go have lunch there. He'll pay for the bill. He also said that he wanted to visit me at my house so that he could meet my parents and spend time with me. He said he could fetch me at work. I was only riding in his car for 15 minutes. I repeatedly said no, and I had half a mind to go out of the car and just ride another taxi. I was slowly becoming very uncomfortable. Then he asked for my number. I could tell that he was making turns that would make the travel time longer, despite having claimed that he knows the area. He kept insisting for my phone number that I repeatedly declined giving. When we were nearing my friend's area, he stopped the car and asked someone for directions. I was completely scared, texting my friend where I was, and they advised me to bolt. I pondered about running while he was out, but just shut off the idea, being the idiot that I was. I thought everything would be okay since it was in the afternoon and there were plenty of people outside, so I stayed glued to my seat. When he got in, he smiled at me in a creepy way and said that he knows the directions to my friend's house, but he won't be going there unless I give him my number. Yep, I should have run. The carbonara just wasn't worth it anymore. My heart was racing. I was shifting in my seat, trying to find the plate number of the car embedded in its windows to text my friends. When he realized what I was doing, he said, "I know what you're doing. There's no use. I just bought this car 2 weeks ago, and the car is still not under my name." I was pretty terrified. At that point, I felt like I had no choice but to give him my number. I thought about giving him my friend's number, but didn't, because if he dialed the number while inside the car, he would know that I played him. Unfortunately, he didn't dial, but he relaxed and turned on the car again. After getting my number, he continued to drive until I recognized my friend's place. He offered to wait until I had eaten so he could drive me back to work or we could go on a date. Having regained my composure at the sight of my friend's house, I politely declined. I called my friend and urgently called her to go out to the gate and welcome me in immediately. Having texted her all throughout the ordeal, she immediately complied. I got out, paid the bill, and went inside with my friend. I can see the vehicle from inside the house, still not budging, but after a few minutes, he went on his way. I felt relief wash over me, and I almost cried at the whole incident. My friend was very mad at me for being an idiot and not running despite having the chance, but she was still very empathetic about it all. She said that I was too kind for my own good. Her father wasn't pleased either. To make me feel better, he let me eat all the carbonara I wanted. I looked at the time, and it was already an hour and a half past my lunch break. Fearing that the taxi driver was still near the area, just waiting, I stayed 2 hours more and spent time with my friend. When it was time to go back to work, I booked a taxi from an app, which is much safer, and I went back to work with no further events. I still got texts and calls from him a month after the ride, but of course they all went unanswered. I never saw him picking up passengers at my workplace again either, and I hope it goes on that way permanently. The incident made me think twice about riding taxis alone, even in the afternoon. But I'm glad I'm able to get past that and be my normal self again. So, creepy taxi driver, let's never meet again.
It was May 19th of this year, my birthday. Me and my mum were just leaving a music gig from a coffee shop, and my mum decided that she'd rather us take a lift than the bus, because the buses around here are extremely dangerous at night, with all of the drunk people and people with guns who start a fight. We've never had a bad or strange Uber or Lyft experience before this one. Neither of us were expecting this to happen, especially in the part of the city we were in, because it's not the bad side. The lift came, and it didn't come up to the coffee shop, though it kind of parked in the dark street where it was hard to see. We weren't sure why he did that, but whatever. We got in, and everything seemed fine. We thought we were on our way home, but it turns out that we were very close to being taken. We both noticed that he was taking a weird route at first, that turned into him not even going in the direction of our town. Note, the address he put in the GPS was on his phone, and it was our home address, but he wasn't following it. We asked him, "What are you doing? Where are you going? You're supposed to go on the highway." He wouldn't respond, and kept his eyes on the road the whole time. My mum tried to tap him on the shoulder. Nothing. The only thing he said to us the whole ride was, "You're going to Andover, right?" We both simultaneously screamed, "No," and he laughed. But it wasn't just a chuckle in a malicious laugh. He was indeed going to Andover, and that was not the city we put in for the address. It's 30 miles away from where we live. He was getting further and further away from our town, and we began to panic even more. My mum called the police, begging them to send a cop car or to do something to stop this man, and they said, "We can't do anything." "Are you kidding me?" my mum said. "We're being taken somewhere by a stranger, and who knows what his intentions are. The operator must not have been taking my mum seriously or something. The operator just kept saying they couldn't do anything about it, and that was it. But they said to stay on the line until we were safe. What if we never were safe in the end though? It sounds like they weren't going to do anything unless this man harmed us or said something violent. They didn't care one bit. As we were almost in Andover, the Lyft driver changed his mind and apparently turned the car around and went back to our town. He still wasn't speaking to us. Me and my mum were still scared the whole time, even after we arrived to our house. I'm pretty sure that I saw a firearm sticking out of his pocket. Both me and my mum are very wary about Lyft and Uber, and we take extra precautions now when we use that service.
I always tell this as a cautionary tale that actually happened to me, especially in light of all the terrifying, heartbreaking news stories of girls who get into Ubers and are never seen again. This happened when I was in college. It's one of the bigger party schools with an entire street of bars you can wander to and from. My boyfriend, now fiancé, had gone back to his hometown for the weekend, so I decided to go out with some friends. I'm sure you can see where this is going. I had a bit too much to drink and was on the edge of a blackout, knowing with my whole mind, body, and soul that I did not want to become a liability for my friends for the rest of the night. I told them that I was going to Uber home. My friends insisted on coming home with me, but selfishly I wanted to call my boyfriend when I got home, and I wanted to have a bed to myself, so I told them all no. But I took a screenshot of my driver's name and info on the app and sent it to them. When he got close, I hugged them all and walked out the door. Like I said earlier, it's a big party school with lots of bars in one area, so the entire strip is lined with Ubers from about 11 p.m. to 3 in the morning. It was almost bar closed, so there were a ton. And look, I was hammered. I don't even know what a Toyota Yaris looks like in the best of times. So as I'm searching, a man rolled down his window and asked if I was waiting for an Uber. I said yes. He told me he wasn't my Uber, but if I canceled my ride and accepted his, he could take me home. I was already thinking of the leftovers I had in my fridge at this point, so I agreed, canceled my Uber, and linked up with his ride. He was super nice, and he was an Uber driver. I've heard of stories of fake Uber drivers, so I did make sure he was legit. He called me beautiful a few times right off the bat, but hey, I was a girl in college, so I got that a lot. I remember we talked about our favorite books. I told him I was an English major, and he was super interested in listening to me talk about tutoring ESL students in my free time on campus. He was an immigrant who had to learn to speak English, so we lamented about how awful it is to learn such an intricate language, but how rewarding the success was in the end. When he missed the turn for my apartment complex, I figured it must have been because he was distracted by our conversation. Politely pointed out that he missed the turn-in, and he said he'd turn back around. Rather than making a U-turn, though, he took the longest way to get back to my apartment. I was still in familiar territory, so I at least knew that he was going in the right direction, but I was starting to get nervous. It was around 2:30 a.m. at this time, and it was super dark, and no one was awake, let alone outside. When he missed the turn-in again, I asked if I could just get out and make it back on my own. He seemed kind of offended, like he was surprised that I wasn't as engrossed in our conversation as he was. I kind of jokingly told him that I was a broke college student and he was racking up my bill during a surge. That seemed to straighten things out a bit. He was all, "Oh, I completely understand," and turned back toward my complex. I was honestly so freaked out and drunk at this point that as soon as he pulled into my complex, I was like, "Okay, right here is fine, thank you," and pulled on the door handle when he came to a stop. It didn't open. I hit the little latch for the lock. Still, nothing. "Let's go get coffee," he said. He clicked the button in the app to say that the trip was completed and clicked out of the app. At this point, I am just trying not to look as freaked out as I feel. I told him I was tired and it was late and coffee was the last thing I needed at the moment. I tried the door again just to make sure that I wasn't drunk and handling the door wrong. It still didn't open. "We should just sit here and talk until you're feeling better," he was explaining to me. "We can go somewhere more private too, if you like. Do you live up there alone?" At this point, I'm frantically digging through my purse for my phone, screw being polite. When he asked what I was doing, I told him I promised my boyfriend I'd call him once I was home safely. Wrong thing to say. He got pissed that I had a boyfriend and didn't tell him about it. He asked me what his name was, what he did for a living, and where he was right now at this very second. When I gave half-hearted answers, he got even angrier. He demanded to know why a boyfriend of mine would be stupid enough to leave his girl alone with another man. He repeated it twice. At this point, I'm just trying not to cry. When I figured my phone must have fallen under the seat, I started digging below the seat. He demanded to know what I was doing. I gave my best impression of a genuine laugh and said that I dropped my phone. He told me to stop digging immediately and not to touch his things. I stopped. Mind you, I'm still drunk as hell at this point. I was just trying to keep everything together and not vomit or pass out. I tried the door a third time. Still nothing. He asked if I wanted to go get coffee again. He even kind of begged a little. I told him no, that I just needed to sleep. He asked if I lived alone. I lied and told him I had a roommate. He asked if it was my boyfriend, and I said no. He kind of got angry again, and then straight up asked if I'd made my boyfriend up. I told him no, and he got angrier and again asked why he would leave me alone with another man like this. I'm usually pretty good at reading people, and I got the vibe that this guy thought he was a knight compared to my boyfriend. So I lied. Through my teeth. I told him I was going to break things off with my boyfriend, that we weren't even really that serious, and that he was an idiot to leave me alone like this. Thank whatever God was watching over me, but that did it. He calmed down and said that changed everything. He asked if I wanted to go get coffee. Again. But I changed my answer. I said, not tonight. He asked for my number and I gave it to him. He called to make sure it was my real number. My phone buzzed from between my seat and the door and I fished it out. He grabbed my phone from me and demanded I show him my boyfriend's contact info. When I did, he deleted it and gave me a big smile. Feels good, doesn't it? I told him yes. He put his number in my phone and gave it back. I told him goodnight in the hopes that he would release me, and he told me that he would like to talk for just a little longer. I had to stay locked in that car with him until 4:30 in the morning. I don't even remember what we talked about. He asked if he could hold my hand at one point, to which I said I need to break up with my boyfriend before I do anything with you. Thankfully, he liked that answer. When he finally let me out, the door was child-locked, so it could only be opened from the outside. The windows were child-locked as well. I walked up the wrong building step and crouched down in the shadows of some random person's door until he drove off. I sat for another 10 minutes and then sprinted to my apartment. After crying on the floor of my kitchen for a while, I called my boyfriend and explained to him what happened. His response was the one I get from everyone when I tell this story. Report that guy to Uber. But even though he didn't know which building in my complex I lived in, he still knew where I lived. I was terrified of seeing him again. I was terrified of calling an Uber. To this day, I refuse to Uber alone, and I make sure I have my phone in my hand every time I get into an Uber now. I realized this could have been a lot worse, and maybe he was just a good guy with the wrong line of thinking, and he did mean well, but I was terrified I wasn't going to make it to my apartment that night. Please be cautious when getting into an Uber. And, Uber driver from hell, I know we've technically met before, but I'm gonna have to take a rain check on that coffee date. Forever.
I'm an 18-year-old female, a student, and from where I'm from, July is an exam period for everyone, so I drag my backpack everywhere. It was 7 a.m, and my exam was going to start at 9 a.m, so I decided to call an Uber and get there early, because I live at least an hour away from the exam center. The car arrives on time, and I go in now, and I'm not the type to judge someone with a glance, but for some reason, the driver of the vehicle made me feel extremely uneasy. He was in his mid-40s. He had dark circles around his eyes and was smirking a lot. He was silent for a good 10 minutes, and then he started asking me questions. He asked if I was a student. I didn't want to answer, thinking he would try to hit on me, so I just lied and told him I was a proctor, hoping that he would back off. God, how wrong I was. He started to smirk and tell me he would always cheat on his exams, that I was a mean person for ruining people's lives. I don't know why I did this, but I chuckled at his comment, and this probably triggered him to thinking I was liking this. My bad. He then started to get personal and asked me how old I was and if I would let my kid cheat. I lied, told him I was 34 and that I had a 16-year-old kid. Mind you, I look pretty damn old, I'm overweight and don't have the best genetics. I hoped this would drive him off since I was old and had a kid, but he got creepier. He then told me I looked like a strict person, and if I had a whip in my backpack. Then he asked if my husband was strict like me, and I told him that he was stricter, hoping to make him sound like a dude who doesn't want to be messed with. That did shut him up for a while, until I noticed he was moving to a completely different region. Now, I'm not a map expert, but I know the exam center could not be reached with that route. I started to panic, but was afraid he would do something if I confronted him, since we were in the middle of a rural area. So I decided I would receive a fake phone call from my coworker and pretended to talk and tell her that I was in the Uber and that we would be there soon. And I shit you not, when he heard it, his car turned around and went in the direction we came from. He continued to make flirty jokes until this happened, and I swear this turned my blood cold. As we were approaching the center, he told me that I should catch someone cheating, come back with him, and let him drive them so he can make extra money after that, and he would take me to my address. The creepy part is that he had studied it by heart. He was looking me into the eyes and made it sound like he knew where I lived. I still remember the mark he drove was a blue Nissan. If I ever need an Uber again and get stuck with a blue Nissan, I'll cancel it no matter what. I didn't call the company because I'm afraid that he'll come after me since he knows my address. I just don't want to be associated with him by anything. So creepy Uber guy, please, let's not meet again.
I'm from a small rural town set in the East Midlands in the UK, and everything is quite spread out. My mum lived on a small street on the edge of town, tucked up into the corner, with very little lighting from the streetlights at the time. The council had turned some off in certain areas to save money. The street was a dead end and shaped like a T, with my mum living at the dead end at the top left. Also, I'm about 5'2", and I weighed about 105 pounds at the time. The incident happened on Christmas Eve, 2011, so I was only 21. I was visiting home from my university up north for Christmas and had gone out with some friends from the area for a catch-up and to celebrate the season. It had gotten late and I needed to catch a taxi to get home. I didn't want to call my mom at 1 a.m. Christmas morning to come and pick me up, and it was too far to walk. My friends had all headed home as they lived much closer to the town center. Unfortunately, I hadn't realized that the taxis were all charging double fares because it was Christmas, and I had only saved £10, the usual amount it would cost me to get back, rather than the £20 it was going to cost me that night. I didn't have my bank card. Silly, I know. And I thought that I was going to have to wake my mum up after all, when one driver pointed out that it was Christmas, so he would do it for the £10. He leaned over and opened the passenger door, and I climbed in. Now, in the UK, black Hackney cabs don't really take passengers in the front seat. You're meant to sit in the back area normally. I was drunk and honestly just grateful for the ride, and I didn't think anything of it. I gave him the street name and we set off. He seemed very friendly, asking how my night had been, what my Christmas plans were, and just regular chatter. At some point, I mentioned that I was visiting from university, and he asked what I was studying, to which I replied, motorsport engineering. At this point, he became fascinated with me and what I was studying. He kept making comments about how he would never have imagined a girl as young and beautiful as me would be interested in cars, how amazing that was, how he thought it was incredible, etc., etc. I thought it was odd, but I'd had some weird reactions when people found out what I did before. Apparently I don't look like an engineer, whatever that looks like. So I just smiled and nodded to keep things friendly as we were nearly at my street. Then things got a bit weirder. We pulled up in front of my street, a few doors down from my house, and of course it was super dark. I'm drunk, tired, and a bit creeped out by his obsession with me and what I study at this point. He's still going on about how he would never have believed it. I was too pretty for that. He would love to see me working on cars, and so on. So I just try to give him the money and get out, but he won't take it. Just ignores my hand, waving the money around, and keeps talking. He had also leaned a lot closer at this point. I tried the door handle to let myself out, but the locks were engaged, and I couldn't find any way of unlocking it in the dark. He completely ignored my attempts to open the door and just kept talking to me. I can't remember everything he said anymore. Mostly he carried on the same way he had been, but with more references to watching me bend over. I was really freaked out by this point, and I tried to say that I needed to go several times, but he just kept ignoring me and saying how he loved how incredible I was. He didn't even know me. We'd been sat in the dark at the end of my street for about a half an hour at that point, with his engine and lights off. There was no way that anyone from the houses would have even been able to tell that there was anyone in the car if they had looked out their window. Then I saw a light turn on in my next door neighbor's window, up the street across from us, and I blurted out, "Oh, that must be my mom waiting up for me. I better head in before she calls and starts to worry." The look on his face was genuinely terrifying. He looked like a combination of angry, disappointed, and also contemplative, like he was trying to decide something. I waved my money at him again and pulled on the door handle, and this time he popped the locks and let me out. I ran all the way to my front door and let myself in before locking everything behind me and peeking out the curtains. He didn't drive away for another few minutes, and I remember being aware that he saw me go into my house and also must have known that I had lied about the light being in my mom's house. I never saw him again and went back to uni 4 days later. I told my mom what happened, and she insisted on driving me around for the rest of my stay. To this day, I still get nervous taking taxis, and I always message someone when I have to use one so they know where I am and when to expect me. So, creepy taxi driver, let's not meet.
This happened 5 years ago, when I was about 15 and not very smart. I was still in school, and back to then I lived in a small apartment complex with about 4 or 5 apartments and 2 stories, with my mother, brother, and sister. That day, I wanted to go somewhere, and my mum didn't let me. So later that day at about 8 p.m, my mother and brother took my sister to the hospital as she was feeling a little bit unwell. Me being the rebellious teenager I was, I got dressed and went out. It's appropriate to mention that my apartment was right by a branch off the main street, so the only thing separating the building was a fence. Inside the fence, there were some parked cars and big trees. So I walk out of the house and walk a little further ahead to a taxi stop, and I did. The minute I saw the driver, I was creeped out immediately. He was so creepy and had an unsettling vibe to him. We negotiated on the price, and I tried to bid higher so he could refuse me and leave. When he persisted, I told him I changed my mind and wasn't going. I headed back to my apartment building, and I was surprised when I looked back and he started to follow me. I was scared and began running and hid behind the cars and trees. He literally went behind my tail and into the fenced land and apparently couldn't see me. I could see his feet from under the car and was about to burst into tears when he left and drove off. I didn't go back to my apartment, but I went to my neighbors and had their son accompany me into my house. That night, I cried and was shaking with fear all night long. Looking back now, I realized so many things that could have gone wrong. Him knowing where I lived and going out late at night in a not so safe area, and me being a small 5'2" teenager. That was really dumb on my behalf, but I'm glad that we moved shortly after.
Some background. This happened a few months ago to me and my girlfriend. I'll be referring to her as Jay in this post, when we went on our first holiday together. We had decided to go to Paris, but could only afford 3 days, so we had to cram in an awful lot of early traveling into a very short amount of time. We live in the north of England, and we're going to France by Eurostar. Cut-price coach traveling from one end of the country to the other is not recommended. Anyway, we arrived at Gare du Nord about 4:30 p.m. local time. Bear in mind, we had been traveling since 3 in the morning and had barely been able to get any sleep on the journey, so we were completely shattered and just wanted to get to the hotel so we could rest. As we headed for the exit, We noticed several crowds of men gathered around the doors, talking to people going past. However, there was one guy standing away from the crowd, looking around at the people going by. He spotted us and came over. He was about the same height as me. I'm around 6 foot, wore a short black overcoat, a black trilby hat, and a shirt and tie. He was mixed race, slim, with stubble, and short dreads peeking out from under his hat. I'll be honest and say that he was fairly handsome. There was nothing especially threatening about him that came to mind. Anyway, he came over and asked, "Do you want a taxi?" We went along with it and told him that we did, and he told us to come with him, all smiley and friendly. He led us away from the crowds through a side door and down a stairwell. That struck me as odd, but it soon became apparent it was a car park. There was some work being done outside the station, so it made sense. The guy then started to strike me as a bit odd. He was almost disarmingly cheerful and friendly, and he kept trying to take Jay's bag for her, even though she repeatedly insisted that she was fine. After a minute or so of traipsing around the car park, we got to his vehicle. This was when I started to get the feeling that something was up. It was a nice car, but there was no taxi sign. In fact, there was nothing at all about the car or the guy that screamed taxi to me. He took our bags and put them in the boot. Then what he said next really weirded me out, and I don't know why we didn't just grab our bags and leave then. "You get in the back, and you get in the front." The person he wanted in the front was me. That just came across as completely weird, but being idiot tourists who hadn't slept since about 5 p.m. the previous night, we carried on as normal and got in the car. Once inside, he told us that it would cost 45 euros to get to our hotel. We were staggered by the cost, but knew that Paris was expensive, and I think we were frankly kidding ourselves by pretending this was just standard procedure on holiday. Anyway, he sped out of the car park with the radio on full blast. Every time he spoke, he sounded nervous and jittery, high-pitched, and peppering his sentences with high-pitched laughter, either like he was in the last place in the world he wanted to be, or he was very excited about something. We were both getting a little bit weirded out at this stage, but he was going too fast. It was then that a very happy accident happened. Somebody's car had broken down right in the center of the ticket gate, and we were trapped behind them. Our driver leaned out of the window and started shouting and swearing at him in French. His tone of voice was just completely off for normal road rage. He sounded borderline terrified. A park attendant rushed around the other car to sort out their problem. I took the chance to ask the driver if he had any kind of taxi driver's ID. His face momentarily fell, but he started smiling again pretty soon. He said he didn't understand, but I didn't believe that for a second because his English had been impeccable up until then. I asked what taxi company he worked for, and he replied Uber. I kept pressing him for ID, but he kept saying that he didn't understand, or that he didn't need one. It didn't matter. I looked back at Jay, and we both just nodded and simultaneously got out of the car. He shouted after us, but we were gone. I went to the boot to get our luggage, and he sped forward. Jay was still halfway out of the car door, and I thought for one horrible moment that he was trying to drive off with our things, or, at worst, with Jay still in the car. But the other car stalled again, and he got about a half an inch before the attendants rushed around him and started to shout at him. Some of the attendants came up to us and were very supportive and kind. They told us where to find the real taxi rank and to avoid anyone like that in the future. They told us they have had a lot of problems with people like him before and that you can never be too careful. They told us that the best case scenario is you get ripped off for about 40 or 45 euros when you can get a real taxi for 10 or less. They didn't tell us what the worst case scenario was, and I'm quite glad about that. Anyway, we found a real taxi driver and he took us to our hotel safely. We got in and went straight to sleep, although we were both a little shaken by what had happened. In retrospect, I think he was probably just aiming to rip us off, but there is still a little part of me that wonders if his demeanor was indicating something more sinister. Call it holidaymaker's naivety or whatever. Either way, we both felt so stupid for a long time afterwards for going along with this guy, and we were both so grateful that the car in front of us encountered problems and that the car park attendants were doing their jobs so well. So, creepy Paris taxi driver, let's not meet.
In January 2011, my then boyfriend and I flew to New York City for his 21st birthday. We were both excited. We'd never been overseas before as we're Australian, and were really looking forward to seeing the city. We arrive at JFK around 10:30. We were so exhausted. Our luggage seemed to take forever to get off the carousel. As we were waiting, we listened to the warnings over the loudspeakers that stated we were only to get into the yellow taxi cabs and not get into unmarked cars. We got our luggage and headed for the exits, where there were a few taxis and one guy in a driver's uniform who came up and asked if we wanted a ride. We say yes, and he takes my suitcase and starts heading across the crossing. At this point, my stomach drops, because he walked past the taxis and continued into a dark car park across the road. We followed him cautiously, because he has my suitcase, but we start to say we're not interested and want to go back. He stops at a black BMW, and I say to him, "Sorry, but we're going to get a taxi." He turns, looks at me and says, "Don't worry, baby, I'm legit." At this I grabbed my bag, and we noped out of there and into a yellow taxi. The driver said to us, "Yeah, you were either almost mugged, taken, or something worse. You've got to be careful out there. I really hope to never meet anyone like that again."
About 3 years ago, when I was 17, I went on holiday with my boyfriend and his family. It was lovely. Long, hot days on the beach, exploring the cities, swimming in the ocean. But then there was one night. My boyfriend and I had hung out with his stepsister most of the holiday. She's a year younger than us and likes getting drunk. Despite the fact that she annoyed us by following us all the time, we still hung out with her. So this one night, she suggests we go and find a club. I state that she and I aren't old enough, only my boyfriend could get in, but nonetheless, we are walking to the other side of the island to get to this club. We're all pretty drunk. I fell over several times along the journey. So we finally get to the club only to see all the people leaving. We didn't realize it was around 2 a.m., and it looked like the club was shut. A bit disappointed, we went to a McDonald's and suggested that we refuel there. I go inside and order, but I tell my boyfriend and his stepsister that I need some air, so I went outside for a cigarette. I'm smoking when a black car pulls up into the taxi space on the road. I have the idea that we may as well get a taxi back. I'm hurting from having fallen down, and I'm very drunk. "How much for the taxi to take us back to," and I told him the name of our hotel. €10, he replies. Now the problem was I only had €5. I said to this man, "Will you please drive us for 5? We're from the UK and we don't know the area very well." He says, "For you, €5. My boyfriend and his stepsister come out of McDonald's with the food and they see me talking to this man. I tell him he's a taxi man and that he's going to take us back. The taxi man is surprised to see them and says he didn't know I was with friends, but come on, hop in. We are all about to get in the car, me and stepsister in the back, boyfriend in front, when the man requests that I sit in the front. I had wanted to sit in the front anyway, and me, being very drunk and stupid, I decide to just comply and go to the front seat, despite my boyfriend's protests. So for the first part of the journey, everything's good. We're all chatting and laughing together, and the taxi man is joining in. We have music on the radio, and I'm looking out the window at the wonderful oceanside views. Plus, the cool air is nice on my hot, drunken face. We all continue chatting away, and the taxi man is being friendly, asking us questions about the UK and just generally making conversation. We all start laughing and chatting again, and he takes my hand, his right hand on the wheel. Bear in mind, this man is probably about 50, very chatty, so at first I didn't think anything of it. I thought he was just being friendly. Throughout our conversation, he's holding my hand every now and then, and I start to feel a little uncomfortable, but I shrug it off. But then it progresses. He placed my hand on his thigh, holding it tight in his hand. I move over in my seat, away from him, but he keeps his hand there, and mine. I turn around and I see stepsister in the back, and she mouths, "Are you okay?" I nod because the man has now let go of my hand. I see the stepsister whisper something to my boyfriend, and they go quiet for a minute. Seeing as he let go, the conversations continue. I can see that we're getting closer to the hotel, and I'm just wishing us to be there quickly. The man takes my hand again, but this time he places it on my thigh, his hand holding mine tightly. I'm feeling very vulnerable at this point. I'm wearing a short, tight vest dress. I immediately clamp my legs together, and I'm silent. I froze. My boyfriend notices and says, "Mate, take your hands off her now." The man laughs and says, "Friendly, I'm being friendly." He continues keeping his hand on my thigh. At this point, my boyfriend and his stepsister are saying, "Stop it, pull over." But he says we're close to the hotel now. I feel sick, the alcohol creeping up in my stomach and throat. The man is still grasping my hand, and he moves it further up my thigh. I'm completely stiff at this point, knowing that if I let my legs relax even in the slightest, things would escalate. But they did anyway. He guided my hand up, and with one of his fingers he touched me. I don't need to say where. You already know. I stare out the window, and I'm begging mentally for the car to stop. Luckily, it does. I jump out of the car, and my boyfriend and stepsister are looking at me. "He touched me," I say. My boyfriend races over to the driver's window, shouting and screaming at him, but the man speeds off very fast, and as he does, my boyfriend kicks his license plate, and we see that it dents. We go back into the hotel, and needless to say, I drink more. The next morning, we're going on a boat trip, and my boyfriend's family are asking if I'm okay after hearing about what happened. I say that I'm fine. It's over now, and it could have gotten a lot worse, and I hope I'll never see him again. We leave the hotel lobby, and that's when I see them. Taxis. White taxis, with a yellow taxi sign on top of them. I head over to one. "Excuse me," I say to the taxi man, "are all the taxis white here?" "Yes," he says. "Only taxi colors are white with the sign on top in yellow." I feel my insides churning. So let me recap this. A 50-year-old man thought that I, a 17-year-old, was alone and pretended to be a taxi service to get me into his car. Gross. Creepy taxi predator, please, let's never meet again.
I am currently living in the Middle East. One night, I decided to go more strolling and watch a movie with a friend of mine. We stayed there for quite a few hours and didn't realize it was already late. We had parted ways. She went home first and I was still waiting for the cab I booked. When the driver came, he was perfectly fine. Nothing sketchy, or so I thought. He was just quite annoying. He was asking too much, asking question upon question. What my name was, where I was originally from, how long was I staying abroad for, where and what was my work, if I have kids or a significant other. It felt inappropriate, so I refused to answer some of them. I just nervously laughed to signal I was getting uncomfortable, but he kept throwing questions at me. I didn't have the heart to tell him to stop asking, or to let him know it was making me feel uncomfortable. So I messaged my friend to call me. We have this safe word we say to each other if we need help, exiting from a horrible person, conversation, or situation. And so she called. We were talking already, but he was still murmuring some stuff. A few seconds later, he turned on the radio and put the volume up, loud enough for me to barely understand my friend. This is when I got really scared. And then he began holding my other hand, like that scene from Titanic when Jack was intertwining his fingers with roses. And then, my mind suddenly shut down. I froze and didn't know what to do. And then I finally heard on the other line, "Hello, are you still alive?" I came to my senses and shouted, "Let me go." He said, "No." I told him I was going to call the police if he didn't, and so he stopped and dropped me off somewhere still far from home at 12 a.m. I called my sister to come pick me up. When we reached home, I was so thankful I was alive. For 1 second I thought I was breathing my last set of breaths. So to the cab driver, I don't think I was overreacting, and your gestures were really weird. Not cool. Let's not meet again.
I used to drive for a cab company. Not a bad job overall. I worked from 6 p.m. to about 3 in the morning. The busy shift for us, because the city buses quit running at 6 o'clock at night. The drivers were all union and the cost effectiveness just wasn't there to run them all the time. So our company would always get a bunch of calls from people needing rides home or out to run errands and whatnot. I picked up this lady who chatted the whole drive, saying how cute I was and asking about me. It's a very customer-oriented job, so I couldn't just tell her to shut up, so I did my best to be friendly. She exited the cab, gave a wave, and was off on her way. The guy who was ride-sharing with her commented that the woman really wanted me. I turned and said it was awkward and weird, and we shared a laugh about it, and I dropped him off and he covered his share of the fare. The woman called the company a lot after that night, requesting me to be her driver. With how busy we were most of the time, the dispatcher would just say she was out of luck because I had other rides on the other side of town or I wasn't working that night. Unfortunately, this gave her my schedule, so she only started calling on the nights that I worked. Every time she'd luck out and get me as a driver, she'd just make the whole trip awkward, talking about how she wanted to travel around and how I could go with her and how cute and nice I was. It got to the point where all 3 dispatchers who worked shifts during the day noticed how obsessive she was about it. It seemed that she would call and waste time telling them all these things about how nice I was and how she liked me and didn't want any other driver. Usual dispatcher, Belle, who worked most of the nights I worked, with James, who worked my first night, and Peter, who was a day shift dispatcher who would leave just as I would come in to start, all told me independently on separate occasions that it was really weirding them out. Pete made a joke out of it. Paul was pretty done with it, and Pam asked if I wanted to just have those rides sent to other drivers. I told her I was done with this lady because it was super evident that she was obsessed. She called all the time, scheduled her rides hours in advance, and always talked about me, trying to get my number from the dispatchers, finding out anything she could about me. Other drivers laughed about it, but I didn't find it funny. For a while, I had to remind myself that she didn't have a car and couldn't stalk me beyond her interactions with the company. Another male driver ended up with her, and the process repeated where she'd call in asking for him, what his number was, asking details about his life and all of that. The dispatchers had had enough at that point, and we blacklisted her, refusing all service to the creepy stalker lady.
Okay, so a little backstory first. I lived in Thailand from ages 13 to 17 as a missionary kid. My parents never really let me travel by myself unless it was necessary. We didn't have a car or anything, so I would rely on public transport. Being a young blonde white girl in Thailand, I usually wasn't traveling by myself anyway. On this particular occasion, I was out at a mall with some friends. and I was going to go home. It was around dusk, and so I was going to take a taxi. I've taken taxis before and haven't had any weird experiences until this time. When I get in, the guy was asking me questions like where I'm from or what my parents do. They usually ask these sort of things because I speak the language a bit, and they're curious like anyone else would be. But this guy begins asking me very personal questions. How old I am, if I have a boyfriend, if my parents are home. I immediately start to become uncomfortable. I gave him a false name and age, saying that my parents were home, and this is not where it stops. His questions continue. He's now smiling creepily at me in the rearview mirror, and I ignore him and just look out of the window. After a minute of silence, he starts to hum, not just humming to himself, but stares at me from the mirror. I wait a few more minutes and have my phone in my hand ready to call someone if he makes a different turn, as I knew most of the paths to my house, so I would know if he were to take a wrong turn. I also start memorizing his taxi number, color, and what his face looked like. He eventually starts full-on singing to me a slow song that I couldn't understand. I finally call my parents and just say to stay on the phone with me. The guy realizes I'm on the phone at this point, stops immediately, and doesn't look back for the rest of the trip. I told him to drop me off a block away from my house, just so he wouldn't know where I lived. I've never gotten out of the cab so fast. I realized he could have been harmless and not intending to be creepy, with his singing and his other stuff, but it was weird, and I was not going to take any chances.
One night, I decided to take a taxi back home after hanging out with my best friend and her new boyfriend. I ordered the car, and both of them waited until I got in and waved goodbye. As always, I found myself sitting in the back of the car, right behind the driver. I knew it was going to be a long ride, so I was happy when my driver, who was probably in his 30s, finally started a conversation. He just asked the basic questions like, "How are you?" and "How was your night?" He already knew my name since it showed up on his display, but then he continued to ask for my age and if the address I was going to was my home. I honestly didn't think much of it. I just thought he was trying to keep the conversation alive since he seemed to be a friendly person. After we'd been driving for a while, he said, "You can sit in the front if you want to." All right, I thought. The only problem was we were in the middle of a highway, so I let him know that I was just fine sitting in the back seat. All of a sudden, he pushed the brakes. Mind you, we're still in the middle of a highway, and demanded that I switch seats. But instead of opening the door to get out, he insisted that I crawl over the middle console. Something about this situation obviously scared me, and I got serious creepy vibes from this guy. But I didn't want to make him mad because the last thing I needed was an insane taxi driver that eventually lost his mind and God only knows what. I didn't want to trigger him, so I couldn't help myself and quickly changed seats. Regardless, the other options would have been to escape into the woods or get run over by multiple cars. I really felt like I didn't have a choice. Once I got in the front, I could see his face. He locked eyes with me for a sharp second, and I noticed a bright, almost toothless smile, and the smell of rotten teeth and alcohol punched me in the face. However, thank God he continued to drive on the right route and pulled up his Facebook profile to show me his 3 children. He then proceeded to type in my name in Facebook and found me right away. He shoved his phone into my face and said, "That's you, right?" We were almost at my house, and in my mind, I was going to give him his money and then run. Right before we entered my street, our conversation went a little bit like this. He says, "Sometimes girls offer to pay me with natural resources." I said, "Oh yeah, like what?" He said, "A blowjob, but I don't mind because I'm single." I said, "Can you just drop me off here, please?" Then he says, "Sure, but I'll walk you home. You must be afraid of the refugees." Refugees, I thought. I'm afraid of you. I opened the door and started to run as fast as possible. I did eventually get inside safely, obviously, but that was one of the scariest moments in my life. So, let's not meet again, creepy taxi driver. Oh, and he's also an idiot, because since he added himself on Facebook that night, I was able to report him and message his wife, because guess what? He was not single whatsoever.
When I was in high school, I lived in New York City. I went to a school on the Upper West Side, but I lived in East Midtown. It was a long trek on the subway back to my neighborhood, so every once in a while my parents would let me take a cab. One day, I was feeling particularly awful. I think I ended up coming down with the flu. My parents were forcing me to go to a therapy appointment. We never got along well, and this was their solution. Even though I was sick, I decided to take a cab from school to the office. I was probably about 16. I was never a pretty girl in high school. I usually wore a hoodie and jeans, and I was looking particularly gross this day due to feeling awful, and I know I was snorting all over myself. I got in the cab, and the cab driver started talking to me, which I usually didn't mind that day, but I didn't feel like talking. He asked me some typical stuff, like my name and where I was from. Then he started asking deeper questions. We were only halfway through the ride and I was starting to feel really skeeved out. He asked me if I had a boyfriend. He kept looking at me in the rearview mirror. He then asked me if anyone was waiting for me where I was going. I was feeling really sick at this point and not using my best judgment, so I said no to the boyfriend comment, but was smart enough to say yes to the second. He then asked for my number, and I told him I didn't have a cell phone. And of course, a few minutes later, it rang, and he looked at me with this god-awful smile on his face. I wanted to escape the cab, but I was afraid if I told him to pull over, he'd speed off with me in the cab. We got close to my destination, and we were stuck in some traffic. I told him to let me out here because I was going to be late. He locked the door and refused. I panicked. He was using words like baby and sweetie to refer to me. I should have just called 911, but I didn't think of it in my state of mind. But somehow, he must have decided against whatever he was doing. We reached a corner. He unlocked the doors. I threw money at him and ran out. I didn't even get his plates. I just wanted to get away. I'm 26 now, and so scared to think what actually might have happened. I've read some of the stories on here, and hadn't thought of it in years. Be careful when you get a cab. You never know what could go wrong.
This just occurred this past November. A close friend and I were on fall break from college and decided to go to an Odessa concert in downtown Chicago. We grew up in the suburbs, so going to Chicago to have fun was common for us. Anyways, we had a great time at the concert and decided to Uber home since we weren't close to the train station. My friend told me Uber wasn't working for him at the moment, so I called the Uber, but this was literally my first time ever calling one, and I accidentally called an Uber pool not knowing what it was. My friend saw that and said, it doesn't really matter. So the driver picks us up right from outside the concert venue. There were a lot of drunk people around, as one can imagine post-Odessa show, but we were pretty sober as all we did was smoke some weed, which we were used to. We get in the car and everything's going normal, but we didn't notice the direction the driver was taking as we were wrapped up in talking about the show. Turns out the driver was going to the south side of Chicago, which we realized after some time by looking at maps. But our suburb was exactly in the opposite direction of this very lengthy drive south. I decided to attribute this to the fact that it was an Uber pool and shrugged it off. until we picked up this next passenger. To be honest, this girl scared us. I don't like to judge people, but she scared us just by looks and how she talked. Once the girl got in, we asked the driver where we were going first, to which he stopped answering. The next thing I know, my phone lit up and said that the Uber trip was canceled, and for the duration of the ride, Uber had no record of me being in the car. I asked the driver what the deal was, and he didn't answer. The girl and the driver 100% knew each other, as they were calling each other nicknames. The girl was being weird and seemed to be doing some hand signals to him. Then we proceeded to drive further south to this neighborhood, the sketchiest neighborhood I've ever seen. I didn't realize neighborhoods like this even existed. Every house was completely wrecked. There were no street signs on most streets. Most street lights were out or flickering. There were homeless people lying on the sidewalks. There were beat-down warehouses and alleys. This was by far the scariest area I had ever seen. No one who cared would hear a scream. Once we started seeing all of this, our hearts dropped because the driver would still not respond to us. My friend then looks over to me and whispers, "We need to get out of here." To which I replied, "Dude, look where we are." So we just stayed in the car. Then we get driven down this alley behind a warehouse where the street ends and there were just fields beyond it. The driver is going like 2 miles an hour, but he keeps going. The girl and Uber driver were clearly discussing something serious, but we couldn't make it out since they were mostly using signals. At that time, our hearts sank even lower, and we literally both thought that we were going to be killed in this alley, or at best, someone was going to get in the car and rob us. He stopped, the doors unlocked, and I was in complete shock with a pale face, when all of a sudden my friend says, "Hey, I'm completely sober and I'm about to call 911. I'm assuming the driver was raiding around the concert to pick up some wasted people to allow this to happen, but we were pretty sober. He was very serious about this. He picked up 911 and dialed his phone. The Uber driver looks back at us to see that this was actually happening and that it wasn't an empty threat. My friend's finger was right above the call button on 911. He looks at the girl, and the girl's in shock too, and she nods her head no. And she goes, "What the hell, Rye?" which is apparently the driver's nickname, and gets out of the car. The driver then drives out of the neighborhood and onto the highway towards our suburb. All of a sudden, my Uber app gives me a notification saying that we are now in a ride. All of a sudden, the driver starts talking to us again, but he wasn't giving us any answers, just saying that he's driving us home. We were asking what just happened, and he wouldn't answer us. He would answer about where we were going, but nothing about what had just happened. We got home safely and reported the Uber driver for this ride because it was obviously messed up. We think the driver was trying to wait for wasted people to call a pool so he could get away with this, but realized we were too big of a risk when it came time to do whatever they were going to do. We've accepted that we were probably part of a mugging scheme and got lucky that we decided not to get drunk at the concert. We had anxiety for weeks after this, but we now know just how sketchy some areas can be and how to be more safe in Chicago by not calling an Uber pool outside of a concert or bar. It's so weird to me that people live this sketchy of lives and do this to people, but it was really eye-opening. So let's not meet Rye ever again, or any Uber pool for that matter.
This happened to my father when I was a young girl, in the early or mid-90s. My dad was in pretty good shape, about 5'10", and in his mid-40s. He had a fairly high-up government job that frequently took him to Mexico. This particular trip had him working in Mexico City. One night, he and a co-worker went out to dinner in a kind of touristy area I think was called Zona Rosa. They went to a few bars after dinner, enjoyed the city, and decided to take a taxi back to their hotel. When they were in the taxi, it stopped at a red light. There was a police car waiting in line behind them. Suddenly, two men from the street ran up to the taxi, and the driver let them in. They attacked my dad and his friend and demanded their money and jewelry. Now, my dad was pretty strong, so when he started kicking these men, it probably did some damage. That's when the men started stabbing him with rusty screwdrivers they had for weapons. His pants were tattered and bloody from all the wounds. Meanwhile, the police behind them, who had a clear view of what was happening, did absolutely nothing, and the taxi sped off with everyone still inside. The attackers take both of their wallets, watches, and wedding rings. Now the men are angry because there isn't much cash. They drive around the city hitting my dad and his co-worker over and over, while demanding the PIN numbers for their credit cards. My dad's co-worker, who spoke Spanish, kept trying to tell them they didn't have PIN numbers, but this just made them angrier. They had no idea what these men had planned for them, as they just drove them around and around the city. Finally, they stopped in an unfamiliar location next to an 18-wheeler. The men dragged my father and his friend out, and told them to crawl all the way underneath the truck. Then both men jumped back into the taxi and sped away, leaving my dad and his friend stranded in a sketchy part of town with no money. Eventually, they got yet another taxi and went back to the hotel. My dad immediately packed his things and took the next flight home. I remember him sitting at our kitchen table looking so pale and disheveled. I'd never seen him like that before. His wounds weren't too serious, but he needed a tetanus shot and ended up going to counseling. Despite what happened, my dad didn't let this experience scare him away from going back to Mexico City. He was brave and continued to travel there for work until his retirement. He says that it could have happened to anyone in any city, but it's still one of the scariest things that has happened to my family.
Just to give you a bit of background, I'm female and I drive for Lyft at night. I'm on the shorter side at 5'4" tall, and I've been driving for about 6 months. I tend to drive in downtown Denver, especially on weekends when there's the most money to make. In this time, I've only had a couple of truly scary encounters. I drive 7 nights a week, at least a couple hours a night. The first scary one started out normally enough for that late at night. I had just dropped off a passenger in Aurora and was making my way back towards Market Street since the bars hadn't closed yet. I get a pickup that's on the way. It's a nice enough area that I don't feel uncomfortable, but anyone who knows Aurora knows that it's not really the best area, even within the nicest areas. A couple of guys hop in, one in the front and one in the back. Both have hoodies and are carrying backpacks, but this is Colorado and almost 1:30 in the morning, so it's really not that odd. Where it does get odd is after they get in. I give them my normal greeting, but they completely ignore me and shove their backpacks onto the floor and pull up their hoods, shielding their faces from the windows with their hands. I was instantly uncomfortable, and I could feel that something was very off. It was only a 10-minute drive, and we were in a secluded area, so I decided the safest thing I could do was complete the ride. I could feel my fight-or-flight instinct kicking in. Within about a minute, I had decided that if they tried anything, I was going to crash my car. Neither one had put on a seatbelt, so I figured that would be my best chance. Once we arrived at the location they wanted to be dropped off at, I could tell it was not a good area. Bars on the windows, trash everywhere, cars in disrepair. They get out, but they don't shut my doors, and they start whispering to each other while glancing at me. One of them has his hand in his pocket, fidgeting with something. I have no idea what. At this point, I've had enough, and I step on the gas, driving off with the doors open. I drove a couple of miles until I get to a gas station with lights and people before I stop to properly close both doors. I called it a night and headed home to cuddle my toddler and my husband before having a good cry in the safety of my own bed. I have no idea what they were planning, but I do know that I was terrified from the moment they pulled their hoods up to the moment I drove off with my doors open. The second story takes place a couple of weeks after the first. I had sworn off all pickups in Aurora and the shady parts of Colfax late at night. I would still drop people off there, but I would also turn my app off and leave the area when I was done. I was downtown as usual for a Saturday night and the bars were closing. I get a shared ride, which can be very good at bar closing. Now, the thing to know about shared rides is you can't request more than 2 seats, leaving room for 2 more people. I have on multiple occasions had a full car with these types of rides. I get to the person and unlock my doors as normal, and 3 people get in. Okay, small problem. I'm polite and I tell them that I can't give a ride with 3 people, so they will have to order a different Lyft. This is where one turns to me. The guy says, "I don't want to pay more." I said, "I'm sorry, but either one of you has to get out or all of you do, and you need to order a different ride. This is a shared ride, and that means I could get 2 more passengers and they need seats. With shared rides, you are only allowed to book 2 seats for 2 passengers." The guy says, "I'm not paying more, so you can just ignore the other rides and take us home." At this point, he became aggressive and was putting his finger in my face. Maybe I should have been more scared. Only, this is Market Street, at bar close, and it's packed. There are drunk people everywhere, and where there are drunk people, there are cops. I roll down my window as he continues to tell me what I'm going to do and starts threatening to put me in my place, but with far more colorful language, if I don't start driving right now. I had made eye contact with a cop and was focusing on getting his attention. I said to the guy, "Okay, now you have a new choice. You can all get out, or I can get the cop right there to get you out." Said cop was making his way over, seeing that something was wrong. They all jumped out, the guy flipping me off, and they disappeared into the crowd, still looking for rides. The cop stopped to ask me if I was okay, and I gave him a short rundown of what happened and thanked him for coming over. I headed off to my next ride, who was a very polite gentleman. In both cases, I reported them to Lyft so I wouldn't get paired with either again. I also carry a foam pepper spray for defense and have a dash cam that records the interior of my car now. Since that last one, I haven't had any issues, so there's that. I live in Chicago and I don't have a car since public transportation is so much easier. I went to a gig at some bar. After it was done, I headed home. My friends and I were all taking different rail lines, so we said goodbye and parted ways. After walking for a bit, I realized how late it was, and it hit me that the bus I was taking wasn't a late-night bus and didn't run past 12. I saw a taxi go by with its lights on, and I just got paid, so I thought, what the heck? I usually don't take taxis because they're so expensive, but I was tired and I just wanted to get home. The guy stopped without me waving my hand, which I thought was weird, but oh well, he probably saw me and I looked like I needed a ride, right? I hop in and he asks me where I'm going. I tell him my neighborhood and he heads that direction. I also didn't tell him where I lived exactly, but I gave him the main intersection closest to me. As we start getting closer, he starts asking about my tattoos and piercings. Whatever, I get asked a lot about them, so I just said where I got them done, etc. He then asks if I have my nipples pierced or other areas pierced, and I tell him no. He then asks me to get a drink with him, and I say that I have a boyfriend, at which point he begins begging me. By this point, we're about to pull up to the intersection near my apartment, and I basically tell him thanks, but no thanks. He then pulls over in a parking lot and won't unlock the doors. I look at him, and he says to me, "The only way you're getting out of here is if we grab a drink." Then he gives me a sinister smirk. I'm practically crapping myself at this point, so I'm freaking out, and my phone is dead, so I couldn't even call anyone. I don't know how I thought of this, but I said, "Okay, we can grab some beer and hang at my place, okay?" I tell him to pull into a 7-Eleven and I can buy us the beer. I get out and tell him I'll be right back. He watched me the whole time. I go in and I act as if I'm asking the cashier to open the cooler for me, but instead I'm like, hey, this taxi driver's crazy, help me. I don't live too far away from this 7-Eleven, and I know the cashier by name. He takes me in back and walks me out the back door, and then walks me the back alleyway to my apartment, which is only maybe 2 blocks away. Meanwhile, he has his coworker keep an eye on the guy until I get back safe. I got home safely and thanked him a million times, and he said he was happy to help. He told me to keep my door locked and that he would try to get the guy's license plate number. The dude left by the time the cashier got back, though. I've never taken a cab since, and I don't plan on it ever again. Hey guys, Raven here. Thank you so much for watching tonight's video. I hope you enjoyed the stories. Thank you to Mort as well for inviting me back to this awesome channel. I always enjoy my time here. If you haven't yet, subscribe to Mortis Media and hit the notification bell so you never miss an opportunity to let the darkness take control. While you're at it, hit the like button on tonight's video too. If you enjoyed my narration, I have a channel of my own called Raven Reads. I post a wide range of horror content from Reddit stories and original fiction to discussions about haunted locations, urban legends, cryptids, and other creatures, to even some book and movie reviews and narrations of classic horror literature. Basically, we're just a group of horror fanatics that talk about anything spooky and creepy, and we'd love to have you join us. Click on the link in the description. It'll take you to a video on my channel where you can click that subscribe button and become the newest lovely listener and an official member of the Conspiracy of Ravens. I hope to see you there. Thanks again for listening. Thanks again to Mort for having me, and I hope you all have a wonderful night.